At 58, I stood in the middle of my granddaughter's birthday party, in front of the entire family, and heard my own son say that I was a parasite, clinging to the memories of my deceased husband. No one spoke up to defend me. No one. And in that moment, I decided, my 12 years of silence were over. The truth I had buried to protect this family would now be brought to light, even if it burned everything to ashes. Like and comment the city you're viewing from so I know how far this story has come. And don't go anywhere, because what happens next will change everything. I used to think silence was a form of love. That was the lie I told myself for 12 years. 12 years of swallowing every painful truth, folding it up small, and pressing it deep into my chest where no one could see it. I thought if I stayed quiet, if I protected the version of our family that everyone wanted to believe in, then maybe the wounds would eventually scar over. Maybe Logan would grow into the kind of man who didn't need to know how close we'd come to losing everything. Maybe Victor's memory would stay clean, and that cleanness would be worth the price I paid to preserve it. I was wrong about all of it. The afternoon everything broke open was an ordinary Sunday in early October. The kind of day that fools you. A blue sky, the smell of something baked drifting from the kitchen, the sound of children running through the backyard. My granddaughter Avery was turning 16, and the whole family had gathered at Logan and his wife Renata's house the way we did every year for the big birthdays. Tables had been pushed together in the dining room. A bakery cake sat on the kitchen island, 16 candles already in their plastic holders, waiting for the moment. I had driven 40 minutes to be there. I had brought a card with money inside, and I had ironed my blouse twice because I wanted to look pulled together. Not because I needed anyone's approval, I told myself that, but because I knew how these gatherings worked. I knew the way Renata's eyes tracked me from across a room. I knew the small adjustments Logan made in his posture whenever I walked in, that tightening around his jaw, as if my presence was something he had already decided how to manage before I arrived. I should have paid more attention to that tightening. I should have read it as the warning it was. But I sat down and I smiled at Avery. My sweet Avery, who still hugged me when I came through the door, who still called me Grammy without any of the awkwardness her parents carried, and I let myself believe it was going to be a good afternoon. It wasn't. The trouble started the way trouble usually does in families, with money and with the particular kind of cruelty that dresses itself up as honesty. Victor's sister Diane was there. She was always there. Diane Carter had been a fixture at every family event since long before I married into this family. And in the 30-some years I had known her, she had never once looked at me like I deserved to be in the room. She was Victor's older sister by 4 years, and she had the particular possessiveness of someone who believes that a sibling belongs to them first, before any wife or family comes along to complicate things. She had never come out and said she disliked me. Diane was far too careful for that. She worked in suggestion, in the raised eyebrow, in the comment that arrived wrapped in concern. That afternoon, Diane was sitting at the far end of the table telling a story to Logan's brother-in-law about a property she was thinking of selling. I wasn't listening closely. I was helping Avery open a gift that had gotten its ribbon tangled, and we were both laughing about it, and for a moment I forgot where I was and who was watching. Then I heard my name. Not from Diane. From Logan. Mom. His voice had a particular quality to it, flat, deliberate, the kind of voice someone uses when they've been rehearsing what they're about to say. I looked up. He was standing at the other end of the table with a glass of iced tea in his hand, and he was looking at me with an expression I had grown to recognize over the past few years, something between contempt and exhaustion, like I was a problem he had long since stopped finding interesting. I've been meaning to say something for a while, he said, and since we're all here, I might as well say it now. My stomach dropped. I set the ribbon down on the table. Logan, Renata started. No, it's fine, he said. He wasn't looking at his wife. He was looking at me. Mom, I think it's time we talked about the house, and about Dad's life insurance, and about the fact that you've been living off both of them for 12 years without ever once contributing anything to this family. The room went quiet. Not gradually. All at once, like someone had pressed a button. The conversation at the other end of the table stopped. Avery went very still beside me. I heard someone set a glass down on the counter in the kitchen. I'm not trying to be cruel, Logan continued, in a tone that made very clear he had decided cruelty was justified. But Dad worked his whole life for that house and for that money, and you've been sitting on all of it while the rest of us struggle. And every time anyone brings it up, you act like you're the victim, like everything is always happening to you. He gestured with one hand, a small dismissive motion. I'm just tired of it. We're all tired of it. I looked around the table. I looked at Diane, who had her hands folded in her lap and was staring at the tablecloth with the careful expression of someone who has been expecting this moment and finds it deeply satisfying. I looked at Renata, who was pressing her lips together. I looked at the brother-in-law, who was suddenly very interested in his phone. No one said anything. No one pushed back. No one told him to stop. And I understood then that this had been discussed. Not once, not recently. It had been discussed at length over time, in rooms I was not in, until everyone at that table had come to believe some version of what Logan had just said. He hadn't invented it that afternoon. He had only finally said it out loud. Avery reached over and put her hand on my arm. She was 16 years old and she had better instincts than everyone else in that room. I looked at my son. He was 41 years old. He had my eyes and his father's build and a way of holding his chin up when he was angry that I had always privately found heartbreaking, because it was exactly the same thing Victor used to do. He was looking at me like I was a stranger who had overextended her welcome, like 12 years of my silence, of my protection, of every choice I had made to shield him from the truth about his father had earned me nothing except this, standing accused in front of his entire family, in his dining room, at his daughter's birthday party. I'm not going to do this today, I said. My voice was steady. I was proud of that, even though my hands were shaking in my lap. Not here. Not in front of Avery. Why not here? Logan said. You've had 12 years to bring this up somewhere else, and you never did. Logan. That was Diane, surprising me. But when I looked at her, I realized she wasn't defending me. She was managing the optics. There were children in the next room. Maybe not today. Diane's right, Renata said quietly. The kids... Fine. Logan set his glass down on the table. Fine. But this conversation is going to happen, Mom. One way or another. I stayed for another 40 minutes because I refused to let him see me flee. I watched Avery blow out her candles. I ate a small piece of cake I did not taste. I hugged my granddaughter goodbye at the door and whispered that I loved her, and she hugged me back hard, the way children do when they understand something is wrong and don't know how else to say so. I drove 40 minutes home in silence, and somewhere around the halfway point, somewhere on a stretch of highway with nothing on either side but flat October fields, I made a decision that had been building inside me for 12 years without my knowing it. I was done protecting a lie. My name is Marianne Carter. I'm 58 years old. I was married to Victor Carter for 23 years, and he died of a heart attack 11 days before our 24th anniversary. Everyone at that table believed they knew what kind of marriage we had. They believed in the version of Victor Carter that his family had always promoted, the hardworking man, the steady provider, the devoted father who left behind a house and an insurance policy, and a wife who had simply been the lucky recipient of all of it. What they did not know, what I had spent 12 years making sure they did not know, was that Victor Carter had also been a compulsive gambler, that he had been a compulsive gambler for most of our marriage, and that by the time he died, the debt he had accumulated in secret had nearly taken everything we owned. I'm going to tell you the truth now. All of it. I should have done it years ago. I found out about Victor's gambling in the 14th year of our marriage, which meant 9 years before his death, which meant 9 years during which I lived with both the knowledge of it and the secret of it at the same time. It started with a phone call. Logan was 12 that year, old enough to notice things, young enough that I still believed I could control what he noticed. I was in the kitchen one evening after dinner when the phone rang, and a man I had never heard of identified himself as someone who worked for a private lender, and he told me, with the professional courtesy of someone who had made this call many times before, that my husband was significantly behind on a personal loan of $47,000, and that if payment was not received within 30 days, they would be initiating legal proceedings. I remember the specific temperature of the air in that kitchen. I remember the dishcloth in my hand. I I remember the sound of Logan's television coming from upstairs, some action movie he'd been allowed to watch on a school night as a special treat. I remember hanging up the phone and standing there for a long time without moving. When Victor came home that night, I was sitting at the kitchen table waiting for him, and I watched him register what that meant, that I knew, in the way his posture shifted the second he came through the door and saw my face. He didn't pretend. I'll give him that. He sat down across from me and he told me the truth, or the version of it he was willing to tell me then, which was that he had borrowed money to cover some losses at the track, that it had gotten out of hand, that he was going to fix it. How much? I asked. He told me. The number was not $47,000. The $47,000 was one of 3 loans. The total was closer to $140,000. I didn't scream. I didn't throw things. I have never been the kind of person who expressed shock that way. I tend to go very still, very cold, processing things in some interior place that doesn't show on my face. Victor had always found this quality of mine disturbing, but that night I think it frightened him in a new way. "Are you going to leave?" he asked. I looked at him for a long time before I answered, and I understood, sitting across from this man who had lied to me for probably most of our married life, that I was already calculating, already measuring what leaving would cost versus what staying would cost. Logan was 12. We owned a house. I had a part-time job at a dental office that covered my car payment and not much else. The math of survival does not wait for grief to finish. "I'm not leaving," I said, "but you're going to tell me everything, and then we're going to figure out how to fix this." We talked until 3 in the morning. By the end of it, I understood the full shape of what we were dealing with, and I also understood something else, something that I have turned over in my mind many times since. Victor was not a bad man. He was a weak one, which in some ways is harder to live with because weakness doesn't give you a clean villain to hate. It gives you someone you love who keeps failing you, and who is also genuinely ashamed of the failing, and who genuinely wants to stop and cannot. I agreed to stay and help him manage the debt on one condition. Logan would never know. At the time, that condition felt like the most important thing. Logan was 12. He adored his father. I would not be the person who dismantled that. The next 6 years were the hardest of my life, and I lived them almost entirely alone. I took on more hours at the dental office. I picked up bookkeeping work for 2 small businesses on evenings and weekends, work I did at the kitchen table after Logan went to bed, entering numbers into spreadsheets until my eyes burned. I refinanced the house once and then again. I negotiated directly with creditors, 2 of whom were the kind of operations that sent people to knock on your door, and I learned to be very calm on the phone with those people, very clear, because panic gave them leverage. Victor tried. I want to be honest about that. He attended meetings. There were stretches of months, once nearly 2 years, when he didn't gamble at all. I would start to breathe a little easier, start to feel like maybe we'd turned the corner, and then there would be a relapse, discovered when I noticed an ATM withdrawal I couldn't account for, or when a statement arrived in the mail for an account I didn't know existed. Each time, the amount was smaller than the last. Each time, he told me it would be the last time. Each time, I had to decide all over again whether to believe him. I don't know if I ever fully believed him after the first time. But I stayed, and I worked, and I kept the secret. What I didn't know, what I didn't find out until years later, was that Diane knew. Not everything, not at the beginning. But Victor had gone to his sister at some point in those years, not to ask for help, but to confess, to unburden himself to someone who wasn't me. I understand that impulse now, the way a person in crisis will reach for someone who feels safer than the person they've wronged. But Diane had not responded the way a person with any decency responds. She had taken that information and filed it away. She had decided, on her own private ledger, what it meant about me, about what I would be owed and what I wouldn't be owed when Victor was gone. I didn't know any of this when Victor died. Victor's heart attack came on a Tuesday morning in November. He was 57 years old. He had been under enormous stress, we both had, and his cholesterol had been high for years despite medication, and I knew the risk was there. But knowing a risk is there and having it arrive are 2 entirely different things. I came home from the grocery store to find him on the kitchen floor. The paramedics said he had been there for at least an hour before I found him. I did not allow myself to fall apart. I couldn't afford to. There was a funeral to arrange, a son to support through grief, a house full of Victor's papers that I needed to go through carefully before anyone else did. That last part, I did alone, late at night, for a week after the funeral. I went through every file folder, every drawer, every shoebox in the back of the closet. I found the full accounting of where we stood, the remaining debt, the insurance policy, the records of everything I had spent the past 6 years paying off. The life insurance money, which everyone seemed to believe was substantial, was just over $180,000. After I finished paying the debts that remained, 2 creditors we hadn't cleared yet, a second mortgage balance, back taxes Victor had let slide on a rental property I hadn't known about, there was $31,000 left. $31,000. 12 years of my working life and every financial decision I had made for almost a decade. And what remained was $31,000 and a house I still had a primary mortgage on. I put the $31,000 in a savings account and I told no one. Not because I was hiding it, because no one asked. Because the assumption, and I learned later that Diane had actively encouraged this assumption, was that I had inherited a comfortable sum and was simply choosing not to share it. In the years that followed, I watched something happen gradually, the way erosion happens. Not all at once, but in such small increments that by the time you notice the damage, the landscape has already changed. Logan had always been close to Diane. She was his aunt, his father's sister, and after Victor died, she stepped into the space that grief left with a kind of efficiency I should have questioned. She was around more. She called Logan often. She came to his house for dinners that I was not always invited to. I told myself it was normal. She was grieving too. Victor had been her brother, but the Logan who emerged from those years was a different one than I remembered. Not suddenly. I want to be clear about that, because the story is harder to tell when it happened slowly. It was in the tone he used when we talked about the house. The questions he started asking about the insurance policy, phrased in a way that assumed I had more than I was letting on. The comments about how I should be helping with things. Contributing, he said, which was a word Renata had started using too. And I noticed they had the same word, and I noticed what that meant. He believed a story. I just didn't know yet that someone had told it to him. The night I came home from Avery's birthday party, I didn't sleep. I sat at the kitchen table in the dark. The same table where I had done bookkeeping for strangers' businesses at midnight for years. And I went through everything I still had. The records were all there. I had kept everything. Every payment receipt, every bank statement, every letter from every creditor. I had kept them not because I planned to use them, but because I am not someone who throws away evidence of her own survival. I spread them out across the table and I looked at them for a long time. And then I went to the box at the top of the hall closet, the box I had not opened in 12 years because opening it cost me something I didn't have to give, and I found the envelope I was looking for. Victor had given it to me 2 days before he died. He had been having chest pains for a week by then, pains he had not told his doctor about, and had only told me about when I noticed something was wrong and pressed him. He had gone to the doctor that Monday, and the doctor had referred him for tests, and I think Victor understood at some level that the referral was serious, because he came home from that appointment and sat down at the kitchen desk and wrote for about an hour without explanation. Then he gave me an envelope with Logan's name on it and told me to give it to our son if anything ever happened to him. I had not opened it. I had not given it to Logan because Victor had died 2 days later and the weeks after that had been chaos. And then months had passed and then years, and the envelope had become something I was afraid to look at. The way you avoid looking directly at certain things because you understand they will change you. That night, I held the envelope in my hands for a long time. I thought about 12 years of silence. I thought about the look on Logan's face at that table. I thought about Avery's hand on my arm, and what it meant that a 16-year-old girl had been the only one in that room who understood that what was happening was wrong. I thought about what I had sacrificed to protect a man's reputation, a man who had loved me and failed me and was now beyond the reach of any of it, and I understood that the time for silence was over. Whatever was in this letter, Logan needed to read it. Whatever records I had in those boxes, the family needed to see them. Not because I wanted to hurt anyone, not out of anger or revenge or anything as simple as wanting to be right, but because my son had stood in front of his whole family and called me a parasite, and he had believed it when he said it. and that belief had been built on a foundation of lies, and I was the only person left who could dismantle it. I set the envelope on top of the stack of papers. For the first time in 12 years, I felt something other than the weight of the secret, something that was not quite peace, not yet, more like the feeling before a long overdue storm, when the air pressure drops and everything goes very still and you know it's coming, and you're afraid of it, but you're also tired of waiting. I went to bed just before dawn. I lay there in the dark with my eyes open, staring at the ceiling. In the morning, I was going to make some calls. I made the first call at 7:30 in the morning, before I had even finished my coffee. Not to Logan. Not yet. The call I made was to a woman named Patricia Hess, who had been my closest friend for over 20 years and who was one of the very few people alive who knew even a fraction of what I had been carrying. I called her because I needed to hear a voice that wasn't going to argue with me, and because what I was planning to do in the next several days was going to require someone who could help me think clearly when I couldn't do it myself. She picked up on the second ring. "I saw the number and I almost didn't answer," she said. "It's not even 8 o'clock." "I know. I'm sorry." A pause. Patricia had known me long enough to understand that an early call for me was never about nothing. "What happened?" I told her. All of it. The birthday party, Logan's speech, the way the table had gone quiet, the way Diane had sat there with her hands folded and her eyes down like she was in church. I told her about driving home and going through the boxes and finding the envelope Victor had given me before he died. When I finished, Patricia was quiet for a moment. "You still haven't opened it," she said. It wasn't a question. "No." "Marianne," her voice was careful, "that letter has been sitting in a box for 12 years. I know how long it's been. And you're going to open it now because Logan said something cruel at a birthday party?" "He didn't just say something cruel," I said. "He said it in front of everyone, in front of Avery, in front of people who are going to go home and repeat it." I set my coffee cup down on the table harder than I meant to. "He believes it, Patricia. That's the part I can't get past. He genuinely believes I've been hiding money from this family for 12 years. Someone told him that. Someone built that story piece by piece until he accepted it as fact, and I let it happen because I was too busy protecting a dead man's reputation to defend my own." Another silence. Then, "What are you going to do?" "I'm going to call a meeting. I'm going to get everyone in one room, and I'm going to show them everything I have, every document, every bank statement, every payment receipt going back to the beginning." "And the letter?" I looked at the envelope on the table. Victor's handwriting on the front. Logan, in blue ink, slightly uneven the way his writing always was when he was stressed or tired. "The letter, too," I said. Patricia exhaled slowly. "Okay. What do you need from me?" "I need you to help me organize everything before I fall apart in the middle of doing it." She came over that afternoon. We spent 3 days going through the boxes. I want to be honest about what those 3 days were like, because there is a version of this story where sorting through old financial records is a clean, purposeful thing. A woman reclaiming her narrative, the papers spread out in orderly rows, everything clicking into place. That was not what it was like. What it was like was sitting on the floor of my spare bedroom with Patricia and going through folders that smelled like the past, finding statements from accounts I had forgotten existed, encountering Victor's signature on documents that made my chest ache in ways I hadn't expected, and stopping every hour or so to simply breathe. There was one afternoon where I found a letter I had written to a creditor in the 3rd year of managing Victor's debt. A long, careful letter explaining our payment plan, asking for an extension, using the formal language I had taught myself to use with those people. And I read it, and I didn't recognize the woman who had written it. She sounded so composed, so methodical. I had no memory of feeling composed. I only remembered being terrified, writing that letter at the kitchen table while Logan was at school, trying to sound like someone who had things under control, because I understood that sounding like someone who had things under control was the only way to get people to leave you alone long enough to actually get things under control. "You need to stop reading the letters," Patricia said from across the room where she was sorting bank statements by year. "I know." "Just make the piles. We'll organize what's there. You don't have to relive every piece of it." She was right. I put the letter down and kept moving, By the end of the third day, we had everything laid out. The original debt documentation, the phone call from that lender had led me to demand Victor produce a full accounting, and I had kept those papers. The bank statements showing the refinancing, the payment receipts, the final insurance settlement documents, every dollar accounted for, every debt cleared, and the $31,000. The savings account statements showing exactly what had remained and exactly how I had spent it in the years since, on property taxes and home repairs, and the kind of ordinary expenses that don't look dramatic on paper but represent the entire difference between keeping a house and losing one. It was all there. Every number, every transaction, the full unglamorous ledger of what my marriage had actually cost and what I had actually been left with. Patricia sat back on her heels and looked at it all. "Logan has no idea," she said quietly. It was not a question. It was grief, I think. Grief on my behalf for what it meant that a man could be so wrong about his own mother for so long. "No," I said, "he doesn't." "How does something like that happen? You were there. He was there. You were in the same house." I thought about it for a moment before I answered. "Children see what you let them see," I said finally. "I worked very hard to make sure he never saw the worst of it. And then when Victor died, I worked very hard to make sure he never found out why the worst of it had happened. I thought I was protecting him." I paused. "I think I was also protecting myself from having to watch his face when he found out his father wasn't who he thought he was." Patricia didn't say anything to that, which was the right thing to do. "And then Diane got to fill in the blanks," I said. "And I wasn't there for that part." Diane was the part that still made something cold move through me when I thought about it too carefully. I had gone back and forth over the years about how much of it was calculated versus how much was simply Diane being Diane, a woman who had never fully accepted me, who had resented me for taking her brother's attention from the time we got engaged, who had a gift for making her biases sound like concerned observations. I had told myself for a long time that she wasn't malicious, just limited, just someone who had grieved Victor and needed someone to blame and had chosen me because I was convenient. But the more I thought about it, sitting on that floor with 12 years of documents spread around me, the less that explanation satisfied me. Because Diane had known about the gambling, Victor had told her, and instead of that knowledge making her more sympathetic toward me, it had apparently made her more strategic. The first sign I had gotten of this was about 2 years after Victor's death, when Logan had asked me, in a conversation that felt rehearsed, whether I had put any of the insurance money into investments. I'd said no, that the money had mostly gone to cover outstanding debts. He had looked at me with an expression I hadn't understood at the time, something skeptical, something that suggested my answer didn't line up with what he'd been told to expect. I hadn't pushed it then. I had been too tired to push it. The second sign came from Renata. Renata had been Logan's girlfriend for a year before she became his wife, and in the early years I had liked her well enough. She was practical, she was organized, she loved Logan in a straightforward way I respected. But somewhere around year 3 of their marriage, she had started making comments. Small ones slipped into conversation. "Logan mentioned you're thinking of refinancing again. Is that necessary?" Or, "Diane was saying she thinks you should look into downsizing. Might free up some capital." That phrase, free up some capital, had come directly from Diane. I was almost certain of it. Renata didn't talk that way. Renata had picked it up from somewhere. What Diane had done, I now understood, was construct a parallel history. In her version, Victor had been a fundamentally sound man brought low by a manipulative wife who had mismanaged money and then hidden the evidence of her mismanagement behind claims of hardship. She hadn't told Logan this story all at once. That would have been too obvious, too easy to challenge. She had told it in increments. A comment here, a concerned question there, a look of knowing sadness when Victor's name came up. Over years and years, those increments had accumulated into something Logan believed was his own conclusion. The worst part was that it had worked precisely because I had kept the secret. Every time Logan had come to me with a question about the money, and I had given him an incomplete answer, because the complete answer required telling him things about his father I had promised myself I wouldn't tell. He had walked away with a gap in the story, and Diane had filled that gap. I had handed her the weapon by staying quiet. I understood that now with a clarity I hadn't had before. On the fourth morning, I called Logan. I had rehearsed what I was going to say. I had the speech ready, calm, measured. I need you to come over because there are things you need to see. But when he answered the phone with the particular wariness he now used with me, that careful neutrality of someone who is waiting to be asked for something, the rehearsed speech went sideways almost immediately. "Mom," his voice was flat. "I wasn't expecting to hear from you so soon." "I imagine not," I said. A brief silence. "Look, if this is about the party—" "It's about a lot more than the party," I said. "Logan, I need you to come to the house. I need you to bring Renata if you want, but I need you to come. There are things you need to see." "What kind of things?" "Financial records, documents going back almost 20 years, the full accounting of what happened to your father's money and where every dollar went." I paused. "And a letter your father wrote to you before he died." The silence that followed was different from the one before it. It had a different texture. I could feel him recalibrating on the other end of the line, that particular quality of a person who has been caught off guard and is trying not to show it. "What letter?" he said finally. His voice had changed. Some of the flatness was gone. "He gave it to me 2 days before his heart attack. He asked me to give it to you if anything happened to him." I stopped, breathed. "I didn't give it to you. I've been trying to understand that decision for a long time, and I can give you whatever explanation I have for it, but I think you should read it before I do." "Mom," his voice broke slightly on the word, just at the beginning of it, and then he caught himself. "Why didn't you ever tell me this existed?" "Because I was afraid of what was in it," I said. "And because I thought I was protecting you. I know now that I wasn't. I was protecting myself and I was protecting your father's memory at the expense of both of us." I pressed on before he could respond. "I'm not asking you to forgive me for that right now. I'm asking you to come to the house and see what I have. After that, you can decide whatever you want about me." He was quiet for a long moment. "Saturday," he said finally. "I can come Saturday." "Thank you." I hung up before either of us could say something that would unravel it. I called Diane an hour later. That call was harder. With Logan, there was grief underneath the anger. The grief of a son who had lost his father young and then lost his mother in a different, slower way. With Diane, there was nothing underneath the surface that I trusted. I had spent 30 years trying to find something in her that I could reach, and I had never quite managed it. She answered on the fourth ring, which meant she had seen my name and considered not picking up. "Marianne," she said. Her voice was pleasant. Diane was always pleasant on the phone. "This is a surprise." "I'm having a gathering at the house on Saturday," I said. "I'd like you to be there." "A gathering." She repeated the word as if she wasn't sure what to do with it. "What kind of gathering?" "The kind where I show the family the financial records from the years after Victor died, and from the years before he died as well. The complete picture." I kept my voice even. "I think it's past time everyone understood the full story." A pause. When Diane spoke again, the pleasantness had become more careful. "Marianne, I'm not sure that's—" "I'm also going to share the letter Victor wrote to Logan before he passed," I said. "I think that will provide some important context for everything else." The silence that followed that was the longest one yet. "I see," Diane said finally. "I hope you'll come. I think it would be better for everyone if you heard this in person rather than secondhand." She said she would think about it. She said she appreciated the invitation. She said goodbye in a voice that had gone from pleasant to something else entirely. Something calculated. Something I had learned to distrust a very long time ago. I set the phone down and stood at the kitchen counter for a moment. Then I went back to the spare bedroom and sat with the documents for a while longer. Not organizing them anymore. Just sitting with them. All that paper, all that evidence of a life I had lived mostly in secret, proof of the debts I had paid, the creditors I had managed, the 18-hour days I had put in for years so that Logan could go to school and not know his father owed money to men who came to your door. Proof of every decision I had made that no one had ever asked me to explain, because explaining would have required dismantling the story they preferred. I had given up so much to protect people who were busy deciding I was the villain. That was the thing I kept coming back to. Not with bitterness, or not only with bitterness, but with the slow, arriving clarity of someone who has finally stopped being afraid of the truth. I had spent 12 years curating Victor's memory at the cost of my own. I had let his sister build a case against me because I had been too loyal to the dead to defend myself to the living. I picked up the envelope with Logan's name on it, still sealed. Victor's handwriting slightly uneven, the way it always was when something mattered. Whatever was inside it, whatever Victor had found the courage to write in the last hours before his heart finally stopped, it was about to become the most important thing in the room. I set it on top of the stack where I could see it. Saturday was 4 days away. I had work to do. Saturday came the way difficult days always do, faster than you're ready for, and with a quality of ordinary light that feels wrong somehow, like the weather should know better than to be unremarkable on a day like this. I was up at 5:30. I had slept maybe 3 hours. I made coffee and stood at the kitchen window and watched the sky go from black to gray to the pale, watery blue of early morning, and I tried to find something inside myself that felt like calm. What I found instead was the particular steadiness that comes not from peace, but from having run out of things to dread. I had been dreading this day for 4 days. Now it was here, and the dread had nowhere left to go, and what remained was just me, standing at a window with a coffee cup, waiting for people to arrive. Patricia came at 8. She let herself in with the key I had given her years ago and came directly to the kitchen without knocking, because that was what Patricia did, and that morning it was exactly what I needed. She looked at the dining room table, where I had spent the previous evening laying everything out, the documents arranged in chronological order, labeled in some places with small sticky notes to make the timeline clear. And she didn't say anything for a moment. "It looks like a courtroom," she finally said. "Good," I said. "That's what I was going for." She poured herself coffee and sat down at the kitchen counter, and we didn't talk much. We didn't need to. She was there because she understood that I needed another human being in the house before everyone else arrived. Someone whose presence wasn't freighted with history or grievance or anything I would have to manage. She was there to be on my side, quietly, which is a thing that sounds simple until you understand how rare it actually is. Logan and Renata arrived at 10 o'clock exactly. Logan had always been punctual. That was one of the things he had genuinely inherited from me. And I heard the car in the driveway from the kitchen and stood up straighter without meaning to. He came through the front door first. He looked tired, the way people look when they haven't slept well and are trying not to show it. Renata was behind him in a gray jacket, her expression carefully neutral in the way of someone who has been coached, or has coached herself. I wasn't sure which. "Mom," Logan said. He looked at me, then past me at the dining room table with all its papers, and something moved across his face that I couldn't quite read. "Thank you for coming," I said. I meant it plainly, without performance. Renata nodded at me. Not warm, not cold. "Marianne?" "Patricia is in the kitchen if you want coffee," I said. "Diane should be here in a few minutes. I'd like to wait until she's here before we start." Logan's jaw tightened slightly at Diane's name. I filed that away. "Why is Diane coming?" he asked. "Because what I have to show you involves her," I said. "Have a seat." Diane arrived 11 minutes late, which I suspected was deliberate, a way of reclaiming some small control over the proceedings by making us wait. She came in looking composed, in a dark blue blouse I had never seen before, her hair done. She had dressed for something. I noticed that, and I noticed that Logan noticed it too, because his eyes went to her when she walked in and stayed there a beat too long. "Diane," I said, "I'm glad you came." She looked at the table. She looked at me. Something moved behind her eyes and was gone. "Of course," she said. We all sat down. Patricia had pulled a chair to the far corner of the room, out of the central space, close enough to be present, but removed enough to make clear she wasn't a participant. Logan and Renata sat on one side of the table. Diane sat at the end, her hands folded in front of her, in almost the exact same posture she'd had at Avery's birthday party. I sat across from Logan. For a moment, nobody spoke. "I want to start by saying something," I said, "and I need everyone to let me finish before anyone responds. I looked at Logan when I said it, because he was the one most likely to interrupt. He nodded, barely. 12 years ago, when your father died, I made a decision to keep certain things private. I made that decision because I believed I was protecting this family, and specifically protecting you, Logan, from information that would have changed how you understood your father. I paused. I was wrong to do that, not because the information was something you were owed as a matter of right, though maybe it was, but because my silence left a gap, and that gap got filled with a story that was not true, and I let that happen. I'm not here to pretend I'm without fault in this. I looked at Diane when I said that last part. She held my gaze without expression. But what I'm here to do is replace that story with the actual one, with documentation, with evidence that doesn't require you to take my word for anything, because I understand that my word at this point may not be worth much to some of you. Logan made a small sound. Not quite a word, not quite a dismissal. I kept going. Your father had a gambling addiction, I said. He had it for most of our marriage. I found out about it in the 14th year when a creditor called the house to tell me we were $47,000 behind on a loan I didn't know existed. By the time I had the full picture, the debt was closer to $140,000, spread across several accounts your father had opened in his name. The room was very quiet. Renata had gone still in a way that was different from her earlier composed stillness. Logan was looking at me with an expression I hadn't seen on his face in a very long time. Something young in it, something that reminded me painfully of the 12-year-old boy who used to fall asleep on the couch watching movies and needed to be walked to bed. Diane was looking at the table. The documents in front of you, I continued, cover everything. The original debt notifications, the bank records from the refinancing. I refinanced this house twice to manage payments, the receipts for every creditor settlement, the insurance policy statement, which I know has been a subject of discussion. I said that last phrase flatly, without editorializing, and I watched Diane's hands shift slightly on the table. And the final accounting of what remained after every outstanding debt was cleared, which was $31,000, not the substantial sum that some people apparently believed I was sitting on. $31,000 and a house with a primary mortgage still on it. I slid a stack of papers toward Logan. He looked down at them. He didn't pick them up immediately. He looked at them the way people look at things they're not sure they want to touch. I worked, I said. While all of this was happening, while I was managing creditors and refinancing and making payment arrangements, I worked. Extra hours at the dental office, bookkeeping for 2 small businesses, nights and weekends. I did that for 6 years before your father died. And I kept doing it after, because the debt didn't disappear when he did. My voice was steady. I was grateful for that. I didn't tell you any of this because I had promised myself you would never have to know that your father had failed us financially in that way. I thought I was doing the right thing. I paused. I thought silence was a form of love. Logan picked up the first document. He looked at it. Then he picked up the next one. For several minutes, the only sound in the room was paper. Tab. It was Renata who spoke first, and it surprised me. These are the actual bank statements? She asked, and her voice had a quality I hadn't heard from her before. Something stripped of its usual careful management, something that sounded almost like she was asking because she genuinely needed to know. Yes, the originals. I have digital copies as well if you want those. She looked at Logan. He wasn't looking at her. He was still reading. Logan, he said to himself, which was not a thing people usually did, say their own name. But I understood it. He was orienting himself. He was trying to find a fixed point in a room that had just shifted. I have a question, Diane said. Her voice was controlled, but I heard something underneath it. The first notes of a recalculation. I looked at her. Why are you doing this now? She asked. Victor has been gone for 12 years. Why now? Because my son stood up at his daughter's birthday party and called me a parasite, I said, in front of the whole family, and no one at that table said anything. I held her gaze. I think you know why I'm doing this now, Diane. Her chin came up slightly. I also have some documents that relate specifically to you, I said. I'd like to get to those after Logan has had a chance to go through what I've shown him, but I didn't want to save them for later without telling you they were coming. Diane looked at me for a long moment. Something in her face, for just a second, went unguarded. Then the composure came back down like a curtain. Go ahead with whatever you have, she said. Her voice was steady. I gave her credit for that, even as it made me tired. Logan had been through half the stack when he stopped at one particular page. I knew which one it was before he looked up. The insurance settlement statement, with the total figure and the breakdown of disbursements. He read it twice. I watched his eyes move back to the top and go through it again. This was all there was, he said. It wasn't an accusation. It was the sound of a man arriving at a fact he hadn't expected. Yes. After everything was paid. Yes. He set the page down carefully, like it was fragile. I thought... He stopped. I know what you thought, I said. I understand why. The story you were given was consistent, and it came from someone you trusted. I paused. But it wasn't true. He looked at Diane. She looked back at him with that expression I knew well, the one that was positioned as dignified, but was actually something else, something that kept its options open. Diane, Logan said, and his voice had a new quality in it that I don't think Diane had heard before either. Did you know about Dad's gambling? The silence went on long enough that the answer was in it before she spoke. Victor told me some things, yes, she said finally, toward the end. He was struggling and he needed someone to talk to. How long ago? She shifted in her seat. I don't remember exactly. Years ago? Before he died? Logan, I was trying to... How long, Diane? She stopped. She looked down at her folded hands. He told me during the last 2 years of his life, she said. He told me he had debts. He didn't give me specifics. He told you enough, I said quietly. He told you enough that when he died, you understood what had happened and what hadn't. And the story you've been telling Logan for the past 12 years wasn't built on ignorance. It was built on a version you chose. The room went very still again. Logan was looking at his aunt with the expression of a person who is doing rapid, painful arithmetic. Renata was looking at her own hands. I want you to read something now, I said to Logan. I stood up and went to the sideboard where I had placed the envelope that morning, separate from everything else. My hands were steady picking it up, which still surprised me. I walked back to the table and set it in front of my son. He looked at it, his name in Victor's handwriting, his father's uneven blue ink. He gave this to me 2 days before he died, I said. He asked me to give it to you if something happened to him. I didn't do that. I told myself I was protecting you. I've since accepted that I was also protecting myself from having to watch your face when you read it. I kept my voice even. I'm sorry I waited this long. Whatever you feel about that, you're entitled to feel. Logan didn't move for a moment. He looked at the envelope the way he had looked at it when he arrived, like something he wasn't sure he wanted to touch. Then Renata put her hand over his. It was a small gesture, quiet, the most genuine thing she had done in the room all morning. He picked up the envelope. He opened it slowly, the way people open things they can't take back. He unfolded the pages. There were 3 of them, I could see, written on both sides in Victor's hand, and he began to read. I watched my son read his dead father's letter. I will not describe everything that moved across his face in those minutes, because some things are not mine to describe. But I will say this. He went through it once, quickly, the way you go through something when the words are coming too fast to fully absorb. Then he started again from the beginning, slower this time, and by the second page his hand had come up to his mouth and stayed there. Diane sat absolutely still at the end of the table. When Logan finally set the pages down, his face was wet. He hadn't made a sound, not a single sound, but his face was wet and his eyes were somewhere far from that room. He knew, Logan said. His voice was barely audible. He knew what he'd done to her. I didn't say anything. He wrote... Logan stopped. He looked at the pages. He looked up at me. Mom. He wrote that you saved everything, that you worked when he couldn't stop, that he was... His voice broke on the next word and he pushed through it. He was ashamed. He said he was ashamed every day. I know, I said. Why didn't you ever tell me? The question had the rawness of something that had been trapped for a long time. It wasn't anger, It was grief finally finding its shape. Because I loved him, I said. Even knowing everything I knew, I loved him, and he was your father, and I didn't want to be the person who took that away from you. That was my choice, and it cost both of us something it shouldn't have cost us. I looked at my son, really looked at him, for the first time in what felt like years, without the glass of all our accumulated damage between us. I'm sorry, Logan. Not for protecting him. I'd probably make the same choice again, and I'd probably be wrong in the same ways. But I'm sorry that my choice left room for someone else to build a lie in the space where the truth should have been. I looked at Diane when I said that last sentence. She looked back at me. For the first time since she had arrived, she looked genuinely uncertain. Not remorseful. I did not have the impression that remorse came easily to Diane, but uncertain, which on her face was almost the same thing. Logan looked at her too. I need to know, he said to her. I need to know what you told me and when you told me. All of it. Diane opened her mouth, closed it. And I need to know, Logan said, whether any of it was true. The question hung in the room. Outside, a car passed on the street. Somewhere in the house, a clock that had been there since before Victor died ticked steadily through the silence. Diane's hands unfolded from each other for the first time all morning. She looked at them. Then she looked at Logan, and I saw something in her expression that I had not expected and had no idea what to do with. She looked tired. Not strategically tired, not performing exhaustion as a way of managing the moment. Actually tired. Tired in the way of someone who has been carrying something for a very long time and has arrived, finally, at a place where setting it down is unavoidable. I'll tell you what I know, she said. It was not an apology, but it was a beginning, and in that room, with Victor's letter on the table and 12 years of evidence spread around us, a beginning was more than I had allowed myself to expect. What happened next was not clean. I want to be honest about that, because there is a version of this story where Diane's "I'll tell you what I know" becomes the moment everything breaks open gracefully, where the truth arrives like fresh air through an opened window and everyone in the room breathes it in and begins to heal. That is not what happened. What happened was slower and uglier and more human than that, and it started with Diane doing what Diane had always done, telling a version of the truth that was technically accurate in its details and fundamentally dishonest in its shape. She began with Victor. Your father came to me about 3 years before he died, she said. She was looking at Logan, not at me. I noticed that. She had positioned this as a conversation between herself and her nephew, as if I were a piece of furniture in the room rather than the subject of everything she was about to say. He told me he was in trouble financially. He told me he had made some bad decisions, and that Marianne was helping him manage the consequences. She paused. He didn't say gambling. He said bad decisions. That's the phrase he used. He told you it was gambling, I said. She looked at me then. He said bad decisions, she repeated, with the particular firmness of someone who has decided on a detail and will not release it. Diane. My voice was even. Victor told me he had spoken to you. He told me he told you the truth, including the word for it, because he was ashamed of himself and needed someone who had known him his whole life to know what he had actually done. He told me this approximately 8 months before he died. I didn't push for details at the time because I was exhausted and I thought it didn't matter. I paused. I understand now that it mattered. Diane looked away. Okay, Logan said. He was holding himself very carefully, the way people hold themselves when they're afraid that if they shift even slightly, something will break loose that they won't be able to contain. Okay, so you knew Dad was in some kind of financial trouble. Then he died. Then what? Diane took a breath. Then I was worried about you, she said, and I will admit she said it with conviction. Whatever Diane's sins were, she did genuinely love Logan. That was what made all of it so complicated. You were grieving. You had a new wife. You were building a life. And I was concerned that Marianne... She stopped. Started again. I was concerned that the situation wasn't being managed fairly. What does that mean? Logan said. It means I thought there was money that should have been more accessible to the family. She said it plainly, without flinching. Victor worked for 30 years. There was a house. There was a life insurance policy, and Marianne was... Was what? I said. She looked at me. Quiet about it, she said. You were very quiet about the specifics. You never told anyone what the insurance paid out. You never discussed the finances openly, and She stopped again. This time the pause had a different quality, something in it that I hadn't expected. I filled in the blanks, she said finally. I decided what the quiet meant, and I decided it meant you were keeping something back, and I told Logan what I believed. The room absorbed that. It was the most honest thing Diane had said all morning, and it landed differently than I anticipated. Not as a vindication, not as the dramatic confession I might have imagined in my worst moments of the past 4 days. Just a woman in a blue blouse admitting that she had decided something was true and had acted on the decision for 12 years. You told me she was hiding money, Logan said. He was looking at his aunt with an expression I recognized from when he was very young, the look he got when he was trying to understand something that didn't add up. You didn't say you believed it. You said it like you knew. I thought I knew. You thought. The 2 words were flat, not a question. Logan, you sat across from me at dinners for years, he said, and you told me my mother was manipulating the situation. You told me she was playing the sympathy card. You used those words. I remember the words specifically because I was already angry at her, and the words gave me permission to stay angry. He stopped. His jaw was working. And it was because you decided something was true? Diane looked at her hands. I believed what I was telling you. That's not the same as it being true. She didn't answer that. I sat with my hands in my lap and I let the silence happen, because there are moments where the most powerful thing a person can do is nothing. I had made my case. The documents were on the table. Victor's letter was sitting beside Logan's right hand. Everything I had held in a box for 12 years was now in this room, in the light, and the only thing left to do was let the people in that room decide what to do with it. It was Renata who broke the silence, and again she surprised me. I need to say something, she said. Everyone looked at her. She was looking at me. Her expression was different from anything I had seen from her in years. Stripped of the careful management, the small social calculations I had come to expect from her. She looked, for the first time since I had known her, like she was not managing anything at all. I've said things to Logan about you that I shouldn't have, she said. Not in the same way as Diane, but I repeated things. I added my own interpretation to things. There were times you asked to be included in family things, and I discouraged Logan from including you, and I told myself it was because of the tension, that it would make things easier for everyone. She paused. That wasn't honest. The honest reason was that it was easier for me when you weren't there, because when you were there I had to deal with the fact that I had already decided what kind of person you were, and you kept not being that person, and it was uncomfortable. I looked at my daughter-in-law. I had not expected this. Not from Renata. I had prepared myself for Diane's partial confession, had steeled myself for Logan's grief and anger. But Renata's honesty arrived without warning, and it hit me somewhere I wasn't defended. Thank you for saying that, I said, and I meant it plainly. She nodded once. She looked like she might cry and was determined not to. Logan had been watching his wife. Now he looked back at the table, at the papers, at his father's letter, and the expression on his face was one I didn't have a word for. It was the face of a man standing in a room that has just finished rearranging itself, trying to understand where the walls are now. So then came the part I hadn't fully planned for. Not because I hadn't known it was coming, but because knowing something is coming and experiencing it are 2 separate things. There's something else, I said, about Diane specifically. Something that isn't in the documents I've already shown you, because I only found it last week when I was going through the last of Victor's papers. Diane's posture changed, barely, but I had spent 30 years watching this woman's posture, and I caught it. Victor kept records, I said. He was not in many ways a careful man. The gambling is evidence of that, but he was meticulous about paperwork, which I always found contradictory, and which I suppose was its own form of guilt management, documenting everything as if the documentation could somehow offset the behavior. I reached to the far end of the table where I had placed a separate, smaller folder, distinct from the main stack. I had put it there deliberately, kept it apart so that its arrival would have its own moment. In the last year of his life, Victor borrowed money one more time, not from a private lender, from family. I opened the folder and slid a single page across the table toward Logan. He picked it up. It was a handwritten agreement, Victor's handwriting, dated 14 months before his death. A personal loan of $22,000, terms outlined in Victor's careful, slightly uneven script. The lender's name was at the top, Diane Carter. Logan read it again. Looked up at his aunt. "He borrowed money from you," he said. Diane said nothing. $22,000. Logan set the page down. His voice had gone quiet, which was, I had learned over 41 years of knowing him, more dangerous than when it was loud. "And you never told anyone. When he died, you never mentioned it. When Mom was going through the estate and managing the debts, you never brought this up." "It wasn't," Diane started. "Was it in the debts she had to clear?" Logan asked me, without taking his eyes off Diane. "No," I said. "I didn't know it existed. Victor never told me about this one." I paused. I found the agreement in a folder misfiled at the back of the last box. I think he put it there intentionally, honestly. I think he didn't know how to tell me he'd gone to his sister. "I forgave the debt," Diane said. Her voice was clipped now, all pretense of the earlier weary honesty compressed back down into something more guarded. "After he died, I decided not to pursue it. I didn't think it was appropriate to add to Marianne's burden." "Or," Logan said, "you held on to the fact that you'd given him money as leverage, as a reason to feel entitled to an opinion about how the estate was handled, as something that made your version of events feel more justified to yourself." He wasn't yelling. The quietness of his voice was terrible. "Is that closer to it?" Diane looked at him with an expression that was, for the first time, something I could only describe as cornered. "You don't know what my reasons were," she said. "You're right," he said. "I don't, because you never told me this either." He pushed the page back toward the center of the table. "You've been coming to my house for 12 years telling me my mother was keeping secrets from this family, and you were sitting on this the entire time." The room went very quiet. I watched Diane process the position she was in, watched her try to find an angle, a reframing, some version of events that left her with ground to stand on. She was a woman who had spent decades operating in the space between truth and interpretation, and she was very good at it, but the document was on the table, and Logan had read it, and the space had run out. "I made mistakes," she said finally. The word mistakes landed with the flatness of something technically true and profoundly insufficient. "Yeah," Logan said. "You did." He stood up. He walked to the window and stood there with his back to the room for a moment, looking out at the backyard. The same backyard he had grown up in, where I had watched him learn to ride a bike on a summer afternoon when he was 7, and had fallen 3 times and refused to stop until he could do it without the training wheels. I remembered that afternoon with a sudden, sharp clarity that had nothing to do with anything except that it was there, alive in me, the way all the years with my son were alive in me no matter what had grown up between us. He turned back around. "Mom," he said, "I have to ask you something, and I need you to answer me honestly." "All right. Do you need anything? Financially? Right now? Is the house okay? Are you okay?" He said it badly, in fragments, like a man who has just realized he has not asked this question in a very long time and doesn't quite remember how. "Because I've been so busy being angry at you that I don't actually know the answer to that." Something cracked open in my chest. I kept my face steady. "I'm managing," I said. "I'm not comfortable the way people assumed I was comfortable, but I'm managing. The house is fine. I'm fine." "That's not the same as being okay." "No," I said. "It's not." He crossed the room. I thought he was going to sit back down, but he didn't. He stopped in front of me, standing, and he looked at me for a moment. This man who had my eyes and his father's build, and who had called me a parasite 3 weeks ago in front of his whole family. And then he got down on one knee on the floor next to my chair. It was such an unexpected gesture that for a moment I couldn't process it. "I'm sorry," he said. His voice was very low. "Mom, I'm sorry. I stood up in front of everyone and I said things I can't take back, and I believed them when I said them, and I shouldn't have. I shouldn't have believed them without ever once coming to you and asking what was true." He stopped. His face was close to breaking. "I spent 12 years being angry at the wrong person. Aunt Diane handed me a story, and I took it because I was grieving, and I was angry, and it was easier to be angry at you than to miss Dad without anyone to blame. And that was wrong. That was my fault too, not just hers." I looked at my son, kneeling on the floor of the house where I had raised him, in the room where I had sat up until 3 in the morning for years paying off debts he never knew existed. I wanted to tell him everything was all right. I wanted to say I forgave him, cleanly, in one sentence, the way people do in stories where the wound was never really that deep. But that would have been another kind of lie, and I was done with those. "I love you," I said. "I have never stopped loving you for a single day of your life, including the days I was very angry at you." I put my hand on his face, the way I used to when he was small and upset about something. He closed his eyes. "But I'm not going to tell you this is already okay, because it isn't. 12 years is a long time to be someone's villain. It's going to take time." He nodded. His eyes were still closed. "I know," he said. "I'm not asking you to fix it right now. I just needed you to know that I understand what you did, what it cost you." He opened his eyes. "I read Dad's letter. He said you were the strongest person he'd ever known, and that he spent every day after he told you the truth trying to be worthy of what you chose to do." His voice broke on the last word, slightly, and steadied. I think he was right. Behind him, I heard Renata exhale, a long, slow breath, like something she'd been holding for a while. At the end of the table, Diane sat with her hands in her lap, looking at the window, looking at nothing, looking at whatever a person looks at when the version of themselves they've been defending for years has just come apart in front of the people they most wanted to impress. I felt something I hadn't expected to feel that morning. Not triumph, one. Triumph was never what I had been after. But something like the first breath after a long time underwater. Something that recognized itself, dimly, as a kind of relief. The truth was in the room now, all of it. After 12 years of silence, all of it was finally in the room. And whatever came next, whatever difficult, unfinished, imperfect thing came after this afternoon, it would at least be built on something real. Diane left first. She gathered her jacket from the back of the chair with the careful movements of someone managing their dignity in a small space, said goodbye to Logan in a voice that had lost most of its usual authority, and walked to the front door without looking at me. I followed her, not to stop her, not to say anything that would reopen what had just been closed, but because I had been raised to see guests to the door, and I was not going to stop being myself on her account. She paused at the threshold. Her back was still to me. "I did love Victor," she said. "Whatever you think of me, I want you to know that." "I know you did," I said. "That was never the question." She turned then, just slightly, enough that I could see her profile. She looked older than she had when she arrived. Not in a cruel way, just in the way of someone who has set something heavy down and discovered that carrying it had been keeping her upright. "I believed I was protecting him," she said. "His memory. The way people remembered him." "So did I said. "We were both wrong about what that required." She looked at me for a moment, really looked, without the armor of all her usual composure. And I saw something in her face that I didn't have a clean name for. Not remorse exactly, not an apology. Something more complicated and more honest than either of those things. Something that acknowledged, without words, that 30 years of history between two women who had loved the same man contained more than either of them had ever said out loud, and that perhaps some of it had simply been rivalry dressed up as righteousness, and that she understood that now, even if she would never fully admit it. Then she walked to her car. I stood at the door and watched her go, and I did not feel victorious. I want to be honest about that. I felt tired and strangely sad, in the way you feel sad when something is over that you spent a long time dreading, because endings, even necessary ones, carry their own particular weight. I closed the door and went back to the dining room. Logan and Renata were still at the table. Patricia had slipped into the kitchen at some point during the last part of the conversation. She had that instinct, The ability to make herself present or absent exactly when each was needed. And now I could hear her moving quietly in there, the sound of the kettle, the ordinary comfort of someone making tea. Logan was holding Victor's letter again. He wasn't reading it, just holding it. The pages slightly creased from where he'd gripped them before. Renata looked at me when I came back in. "Is she okay?" she asked, and I understood she meant Diane, which surprised me. That Renata's first question was about the woman who had caused most of the damage. "I don't know," I said honestly. "I think she's been okay for so long by her own definition that she's not sure what okay looks like right now." Renata nodded slowly, like that made a kind of sense. I sat back down. The three of us were quiet for a moment, sitting among all those papers, all that evidence of a life that had been lived in the margins of what everyone else thought they knew. "I want to ask you something," Logan said. He set the letter down carefully. "And I need you to answer me honestly, even if the answer is bad. All right? How long were you angry at me before the birthday party? Before that? Before it finally came out? How long had you been carrying that?" I thought about it, not performing the thinking, but actually sitting with the question, because it deserved a real answer. "A long time," I said finally. I don't know exactly when the grief of it became something more like anger. Probably somewhere around year 5 or 6, when I started to understand that the distance between us wasn't something that was going to naturally correct itself. That it had been built, and built deliberately, and that I had helped build it by staying quiet. I looked at my hands. I wasn't angry at you for grieving your father. I wasn't even angry at you for believing what you were told. I was angry at myself, mostly, for letting it go so long. For deciding that keeping the peace was more important than being known. That's the part I can't. He stopped, started again. That's the part I keep coming back to. You sacrificed your own reputation inside this family to protect Dad's. You let people think badly of you rather than tell the truth about him. That is, he shook his head. I don't know if I could do that. You might be surprised, I said. Love makes people do things they wouldn't predict. And it wasn't only love, it was habit by the end. The secret had been the secret for so long that telling it would have required dismantling a version of our family that I had worked very hard to maintain. I paused. There's a certain comfort in the structure of a lie, even when the lie is costing you everything. The structure feels stable even when it isn't, even when it's actively collapsing. Mom, his voice had a roughness to it. I called you a parasite. I know. In front of Avery. I know. He put both hands flat on the table, the way he used to as a boy when he was trying to hold himself together. I don't know how you're sitting here talking to me like a normal person right now. Because you're my son, I said. And because I didn't come through 12 years of what I came through to lose you over one afternoon, even an afternoon like that one. I looked at him directly. But Logan, and I need you to hear this the way I mean it, not the gentle version. This can't happen again. Not the accusations in front of people. Not the decisions made without asking me. Not the years of distance built on stories you never verified. I felt my voice steady in a way that had nothing to do with composure and everything to do with having finally arrived somewhere I intended to stay. I love you. That doesn't change. But I'm 58 years old and I have earned the right to be treated with basic decency by my own family. That is not negotiable anymore. It wasn't negotiable before, I just didn't enforce it. I'm going to enforce it now. The room was quiet. Renata let out a small breath. Not relief, exactly. More like recognition. That's fair, Logan said. His voice was rough. That's fair. Good, I said. And then, because neither of us knew quite what to do with the enormity of everything that had just been said, I called to Patricia in the kitchen and asked if the tea was ready. The weeks that followed were not a transformation. I want to be clear about that, because transformations are for stories that don't have to keep living on the other side of their ending. What the weeks following that Saturday were was something harder and more ordinary. The slow, uneven work of people trying to behave differently than they had been behaving without the drama of a revelation to sustain them. Logan called me on a Tuesday evening, 3 days after the gathering. Not for any specific reason, not with news, not with a question about the documents or Diane or anything practical. He called because it was Tuesday evening and he had thought of me and he was trying to build a new habit out of the wreckage of the old one. We talked for 20 minutes about nothing consequential. A television show he'd been watching, a problem he was having with the gutters at his house, something funny Avery had said at dinner. Small things. The kind of small things that are the actual substance of closeness between people. The sediment that builds up over years of ordinary contact into something solid enough to stand on. I didn't cry when we hung up. I sat with the phone in my lap for a moment and understood that this small, unremarkable phone call was what I had actually been missing for 12 years. Not reconciliation as an event, just my son calling on a Tuesday. Renata called separately, which surprised me. She didn't phone. She wasn't yet comfortable enough for that, and I respected the honesty of that limitation. She sent a text, which said, "I want to try to do this differently. I don't know exactly how yet, but I wanted you to know I'm trying." I wrote back, "That's enough for now." And I meant it. Avery came by the house the following weekend. She drove herself. She had her license now, which still startled me, the fact of my granddaughter navigating roads in a car. And she showed up at the door with a container of cookies she had baked herself, slightly overdone on the bottom because she had been distracted by something and forgotten to check the timer. She handed them to me and said, "I know you don't know exactly what happened at Dad's house, but I want you to know that I've always been on your side," in the direct, uncomplicated way of a 16-year-old who has not yet learned to obscure the things she feels. I pulled her into a hug that went on probably too long, and she let me, which was its own kind of gift. "The cookies are a little burned," she said into my shoulder. "They're perfect," I said. They weren't. We ate them anyway, sitting at the kitchen table, and she told me about school and a boy she was not quite admitting she liked and a fight she'd had with a friend that was in the process of resolving itself. And I listened to every word of it with the full attention of a woman who understands that being allowed into someone's ordinary life is not something to take lightly. Diane and I did not speak for 6 weeks after that Saturday. I was not waiting for her call. I had said what needed to be said, and I had meant what I'd said to her at the door. That we had both made mistakes, that we had both been protecting things we had no business unilaterally deciding to protect. I did not feel that I owed her anything further, and I did not feel she owed me an apology in the transactional sense, where a set of words could settle a 12-year account. Some debts don't clear that way. Some damage is simply damage, and the only honest thing to do with it is acknowledge it and decide how to proceed. She called on a Thursday afternoon in November, about 6 weeks after the gathering. I almost didn't answer. I saw her name, and I sat with the phone in my hand through 2 rings, deciding. I picked up. "Marianne," she said. Her voice was different. Not the pleasant phone voice, not the controlled voice from the gathering, something smaller, more uncertain. "Diane." A pause. "I've been trying to figure out what to say to you for 6 weeks, she said. "I've written probably 4 versions of this phone call in my head, and they all sound either defensive or performed, and I decided the honest thing was to call without a script and accept that it was going to be uncomfortable." "All right," I said. "I was jealous of you," she said. "From the beginning, from before you married Victor. He changed when he met you. He became less available to me, which was normal, which was what was supposed to happen, and I knew that, but I didn't accept it." Her voice was measured but not mechanical. She was working at this, and I could hear the work. "And when he died, I had 12 years of... It doesn't matter how I felt. What matters is what I did with it, and what I did with it was wrong. I built a case against you that I had no right to build, and I built it with your son, who deserved better from me." She paused. "I'm sorry. I know that doesn't cover it. I'm not asking you to tell me it does." I sat with that for a moment. "It doesn't cover it," I said. "But I hear you." "That's all I'm asking for," she said. "I'm not ready to pretend the last 12 years didn't happen," I said. "I don't know if I'll ever be ready for that, but I'm not interested in carrying permanent hatred either. It's too heavy, and it doesn't accomplish anything except exhausting me." I paused. "You loved Victor. I loved Victor. We managed that fact badly between us for 30 years. I don't know that it had to go the way it went. No, she said quietly. It didn't. We talked for a few more minutes. Not warmly. Warmth was not available yet, and I wasn't going to perform it. But honestly. Two women at the end of a very long misunderstanding, trying to find the edges of what they could and couldn't offer each other, which was more than nothing and less than the family they might have been. It was a start. A small, imperfect, entirely human start. But I went through Victor's letter one more time, alone, on a Sunday evening in December. Logan had kept the original. It belonged to him. It had always belonged to him. But I had written out the parts I needed to carry with me, the parts that had mattered most in all the years I'd been afraid to open the envelope. He had written, I know what you gave up to stand beside me when I didn't deserve it. I know what it cost you, and I know I never fully paid that debt, not because I didn't want to, but because I didn't know how, and I was too ashamed to learn. I hope Logan understands someday that his mother is the reason there was anything left worth understanding. I sat with those words for a long time. Then I folded the paper, put it back in the box, and put the box back in the closet. Not because I needed to hide it anymore, because it had done what it needed to do, and some things are allowed to rest. I am 58 years old, and I have learned some things at great cost that I wish I had understood earlier, and because this story is mine to tell, I will tell you what they are. Silence is not love. I believe for most of my marriage and all of my widowhood that protecting people from painful truths was a form of devotion, that swallowing hard things to preserve someone else's comfort was the highest expression of care. I was wrong. Silence is not love. It is fear wearing love's clothes. It is the decision to protect yourself from the difficulty of being truly known, dressed up as selflessness. Real love requires the courage to be honest, even when honesty is expensive, even when it costs you the version of things you've been working to maintain. Loyalty to the dead cannot come at the expense of the living. I gave 12 years of my dignity, my reputation inside my own family, my relationship with my son, to preserve a dead man's image. Victor is beyond harm now. He cannot be hurt by the truth. But I could be hurt by the lie. And I was, every day, for 12 years. The living have a right to the truth. The dead have no right to its suppression. You are allowed to defend yourself. This is the one I struggle with most, because I was raised in the tradition of women who absorb rather than confront, who smooth rather than demand, who make themselves smaller to keep the peace. I want to say clearly, to anyone who recognizes themselves in what I've described, you are allowed to defend yourself. You're allowed to say this is not true and demand that the truth be heard. You're allowed to draw lines around your own dignity and stand at those lines and refuse to move. Not aggressively, not cruelly, but firmly, quietly, with the full authority of a person who knows their own story. Age does not diminish your right to be treated with respect. There were years when I accepted treatment from my son and his wife that I would never have accepted from a stranger, because I told myself that keeping access to them was worth the cost of the indignity. It was not. The price of belonging to a family should never be your self-respect. If it is, that is not belonging. It is a transaction dressed up as love, and you are allowed to name it for what it is. And finally, truth is not a weapon. I did not call that Saturday gathering to destroy Diane or to win an argument with Logan or to be vindicated in some dramatic public sense. I called it because the lie had been in the room for 12 years, and I was tired of breathing around it. I brought the truth because we couldn't build anything real on top of a false foundation, and I wanted, after everything, after all of it, to have something real with my son. Not a performance of a family, an actual one, built on what actually happened, with all the difficulty that implies. We are building that now. Slowly, imperfectly. Logan calls on Tuesdays. Renata is trying. Avery brings burned cookies and tells me about boys. Diane and I exist at a cautious distance that might, one day, become something more, or might not, and we will manage that too. The house is still mine. The mortgage is still on it. The $31,000 is mostly spent on property taxes and a new roof and the ordinary expenses of an ordinary life that no one who believed I was wealthy ever asked about. I am not comfortable. I am not restored to some version of security I never actually had. I work part-time still because I need to, and I keep my own books, and I manage my own finances with the same careful attention I taught myself in the worst years, because that competence is mine and no one can take it from me. I am not happy in the simple sense of the word. I am something more complicated than happy. I am known, finally, by my son, by myself, by the people who matter. I am no longer the woman in the story that someone else wrote about me. I am the woman who sat down with 12 years of documents and a sealed letter and said, "No more. Enough. The truth is in this room now, and we are all going to live inside it. That is enough. After everything, after all of it, that is enough." Diane and I did not speak for 6 weeks after that Saturday. I was not waiting for her call. I had said what needed to be said, and I had meant what I'd said to her at the door. That we had both made mistakes, that we had both been protecting things we had no business unilaterally deciding to protect. I did not feel that I owed her anything further, and I did not feel she owed me an apology in the transactional sense, where a set of words could settle a 12-year account. Some debts don't clear that way. Some damage is simply damage, and the only honest thing to do with it is acknowledge it and decide how to proceed. She called on a Thursday afternoon in November, about 6 weeks after the gathering. I almost didn't answer. I saw her name and I sat with the phone in my hand through 2 rings, deciding. I picked up. "Marianne," she said. Her voice was different, not the pleasant phone voice, not the controlled voice from the gathering, something smaller, more uncertain. "Diane." A pause. "I've been trying to figure out what to say to you for 6 weeks, she said. "I've written probably 4 versions of this phone call in my head, and they all sound either defensive or performed, and I decided the honest thing was to call without a script and accept that it was going to be uncomfortable." "All right," I said. "I was jealous of you," she said. "From the beginning, from before you married Victor. He changed when he met you. He became less available to me, which was normal, which was what was supposed to happen, and I knew that, but I didn't accept it." Her voice was measured but not mechanical. She was working at this, and I could hear the work. "And when he died, I had 12 years of... It doesn't matter how I felt. What matters is what I did with it, and what I did with it was wrong. I built a case against you that I had no right to build, and I built it with your son who deserved better from me." She paused. "I'm sorry. I know that doesn't cover it. I'm not asking you to tell me it does." I sat with that for a moment. "It doesn't cover it," I said, "but I hear you." "That's all I'm asking for," she said. "I'm not ready to pretend the last 12 years didn't happen," I said. "I don't know if I'll ever be ready for that, but I'm not interested in carrying permanent hatred either. It's too heavy, and it doesn't accomplish anything except exhausting me." I paused. "You loved Victor. I loved Victor. We managed that fact badly between us for 30 years. I don't know that it had to go the way it went." "No," she said quietly. "It didn't." We talked for a few more minutes. Not warmly. Warmth was not available yet, and I wasn't going to perform it. But honestly, 2 women at the end of a very long misunderstanding, trying to find the edges of what they could and couldn't offer each other, which was more than nothing and less than the family they might have been. It was a start, a small, imperfect, entirely human start. Bob. I went through Victor's letter one more time, alone, on a Sunday evening in December. Logan had kept the original. It belonged to him. It had always belonged to him. But I'd written out the parts I needed to carry with me, the parts that had mattered most in all the years I'd been afraid to open the envelope. He had written, "I know what you gave up to stand beside me when I didn't deserve it. I know what it cost you, and I know I never fully paid that debt, not because I didn't want to, but because I didn't know how, and I was too ashamed to learn. I hope Logan understands someday that his mother is the reason there was anything left worth understanding." I sat with those words for a long time. Then I folded the paper, put it back in the box, and put the box back in the closet. Not because I needed to hide it anymore, because it had done what it needed to do, and some things are allowed to rest. I am 58 years old, and I have learned some things at great cost that I wish I had understood earlier, and because this story is mine to tell, I will tell you what they are. Silence is not love. I believe for most of my marriage and all of my widowhood that protecting people from painful truths was a form of devotion, that swallowing hard things to preserve someone else's comfort was the highest expression of care. I was wrong. Silence is not love. It is fear wearing love's clothes. It is the decision to protect yourself from the difficulty of being truly known, dressed up as selflessness. Real love requires the courage to be honest, even when honesty is expensive, even when it costs you the version of things you've been working to maintain. Loyalty to the dead cannot come at the expense of the living. I gave 12 years of my dignity, my reputation inside my own family, my relationship with my son, to preserve a dead man's image. Victor is beyond harm now. He cannot be hurt by the truth, but I could be hurt by the lie. And I was, every day, for 12 years. The living have a right to the truth. The dead have no right to its suppression. You're allowed to defend yourself. This is the one I struggle with most because I was raised in the tradition of women who absorb rather than confront, who smooth rather than demand, who make themselves smaller to keep the peace. I want to say clearly, to anyone who recognizes themselves in what I've described, you're allowed to defend yourself. You're allowed to say this is not true and demand that the truth be heard. You're allowed to draw lines around your own dignity and stand at those lines and refuse to move. Not aggressively, not cruelly, but firmly, quietly, with the full authority of a person who knows their own story. Age does not diminish your right to be treated with respect. There were years when I accepted treatment from my son and his wife that I would never have accepted from a stranger, because I told myself that keeping access to them was worth the cost of the indignity. It was not. The price of belonging to a family should never be your self-respect. If it is, that is not belonging. It is a transaction dressed up as love, and you are allowed to name it for what it is. And finally, truth is not a weapon. I did not call that Saturday gathering to destroy Diane or to win an argument with Logan or to be vindicated in some dramatic public sense. I called it because the lie had been in the room for 12 years, and I was tired of breathing around it. I brought the truth because we couldn't build anything real on top of a false foundation, and I wanted, after everything, after all of it, to have something real with my son, not a performance of a family, an actual one, built on what actually happened, with all the difficulty that implies. We are building that now, slowly, imperfectly. Logan calls on Tuesdays. Renata is trying. Avery brings burned cookies and tells me about boys. Diane and I exist at a cautious distance that might, one day, become something more, or might not, and we will manage that too. The house is still mine. The mortgage is still on it. The $31,000 is mostly spent on property taxes and a new roof and the ordinary expenses of an ordinary life that no one who believed I was wealthy ever asked about. I am not comfortable. I am not restored to some version of security I never actually had. I work part-time still because I need to, and I keep my own books, and I manage my own finances with the same careful attention I taught myself in the worst years, because that competence is mine, and no one can take it from me. I am not happy in the simple sense of the word. I am something more complicated than happy. I am known, finally, by my son, by myself, by the people who matter. I am no longer the woman in the story that someone else wrote about me. I am the woman who sat down with 12 years of documents and a sealed letter and said, "No more. Enough. The truth is in this room now and we are all going to live inside it. That is enough. After everything, after all of it, that is enough."